The church hid the forbidden gospels that confirmed Jesus had brothers. And if today, just today, you are about to discover a truth that the church hid for 1,700 years, have you wondered with growing unease why certain ancient texts mysteriously disappeared from official history without a trace? Stop for a moment and think deeply about this. What exactly would happen if I told you that absolutely everything you thought you knew about the real life of Jesus is only a carefully edited fraction of the complete truth? What if I revealed to you that there is absolutely compelling, archaeologically verifiable historical evidence that has been deliberately and systematically hidden for over 1,700 consecutive years? What you are about to discover in this video is not a modern conspiracy theory or baseless academic speculation. It is a fully documented, archaeologically supported, linguistically verifiable, and historically undeniable historical truth that could forever change your fundamental understanding of one of the most important and influential figures in all of human history. For more than 17 consecutive centuries, the most powerful and influential religious institutions in the entire world have kept in absolute secrecy extraordinary documents revealing deeply uncomfortable, politically inconvenient, and theologically challenging truths about the real, everyday, and completely human life of Jesus of Nazareth. Truths that directly question fundamental dogmas that millions of people have accepted without question. Truths that frontally challenge official interpretations that have been imposed for millennia. Truths that, according to some more conservative religious leaders, are too dangerous, too revolutionary, too destabilizing for the masses to know without institutional oversight. Today, finally, after centuries of enforced silence, these carefully guarded secrets are fully revealed to the public. The forbidden gospels, those texts declared heretical by church councils, not only existed historically, but contain specific information that the highest religious hierarchy considered so threatening to its power structures that it preferred to completely erase it from the official history it would teach future generations. Among these systematically censored revelations is one that has been especially silenced, a truth that shakes the very foundations of the most fundamental traditional doctrine. Jesus had real biological brothers. We are not talking about abstract or symbolic, spiritual brothers as we have been insistently led to believe during centuries of indoctrination. We are specifically talking about blood brothers of flesh and blood of a real and completely earthly family that lived, breathed, walked, ate, and slept alongside him day after day. This is not a progressive modern interpretation or a contemporary liberal reinterpretation of ambiguous ancient texts. It is an absolutely documented historical reality that has been systematically and deliberately hidden, meticulously erased, and categorically denied by those who have controlled official religious narratives for entire millennia. The apocryphal texts, those gospels that were officially declared heretical and strictly prohibited by the most important church councils, repeatedly, specifically, and in detail, mention Jesus' biological brothers. They speak of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon with specific proper names, with clearly differentiated personalities, with specific and documented roles in everyday family life. They describe a completely earthly family, absolutely human, totally real and ordinary. But this simple and natural information was considered so deeply threatening to the official doctrinal structure being built that it was buried in the darkest and most inaccessible depths of the most closely guarded secret archives. If you're watching this video at this very moment, it's because you too have felt deeply that something fundamental doesn't fit with the official narrative you've been taught your entire life. That nagging, persistent feeling that you've been told only a carefully fragmented part of the complete and true story. That deep, nagging intuition that constantly whispers to you that there are far more hidden truths, more buried secrets, more censored information behind the official dogmas you've been mechanically taught since childhood without being allowed to question. You're not crazy for feeling this constant spiritual restlessness. You're not alone in this desperate search for authentic and verifiable answers. You're not the only one who has experienced that deeply disturbing feeling of systematic spiritual deception, of institutional religious manipulation. Millions upon millions of people around the world are simultaneously awakening to this same absolutely devastating and liberating realization. They've spent entire years, perhaps entire decades of their lives, persistently wondering why certain specific topics are completely taboo in their respective religious communities. You have repeatedly questioned why some fundamental and logical questions simply cannot be asked openly without being immediately labeled a dangerous heretic, a spiritual rebel, or an enemy of the faith. You have wondered with growing frustration why some ancient texts are considered so dangerous, so threatening, so subversive that they cannot even be casually mentioned in serious theological conversations without provoking immediate defensive reactions. Your genuine and authentic spiritual quest has brought you exactly to this precise moment of revelation because your soul intuitively recognizes at a deep and instinctive level that you deserve to know the full, uncensored truth about your own faith, not carefully edited fragments by church committees with political agendas, not politically convenient versions designed for established power structures, not meticulously filtered interpretations through institutional agendas with specific economic interest to protect. The real raw truth, unfiltered, untampered with deliberate emissions, without convenient edits. That deep sense of systematic deception you've experienced for so much of your life has a specific and technically documented name: systematic and deliberate institutional religious manipulation. For 17 consecutive centuries, the most important religious power structures have arbitrarily and unilaterally decided what you are specifically allowed to know and what you must completely ignore about your own most intimate personal faith. They have meticulously and systematically filtered spiritual information as if you were a small child completely incapable of handling the real complexity, genuine richness, and authentic depth of documented historical truth. They have consistently treated you as a spiritual minor, as if you lacked the minimal intellectual capacity or basic emotional maturity to process information that challenges the simplified and artificial narratives they have sold you as absolute and unquestionable truths. But you are not a helpless child in need of institutional protection. You are a legitimate and mature seeker of authentic and verifiable truth, and the truth you are about to discover will not only completely free you from the invisible but powerful chains of blind dogma, but will exponentially and dramatically deepen your genuine and personal connection with the divine in ways you cannot even imagine yet. Because true, authentic spiritual faith fears absolutely nothing of documented historical truth. True spirituality is dramatically and exponentially strengthened by real verifiable knowledge. It is never, ever weakened by authentic, honest information. Before continuing with these revelations that will forever change your spiritual perspective in profound and irreversible ways, I sincerely and urgently invite you to subscribe to this channel right now, because here we speak without fear, without censorship, and without limits about truths that other channels never dare to reveal due to institutional cowardice, political pressure, or economic interests. Subscribe immediately, because what comes next will impact your understanding of the world even more profoundly than you can imagine. The forgotten Gospels, those texts that have been systematically ignored and deliberately hidden, are not romantic myths invented by fanciful medieval writers. No, are legends fabricated by later communities with specific theological agendas. They are absolutely real, archaeologically verifiable, linguistically authentic, and chronologically contemporary historical documents that were deliberately, systematically, and meticulously excluded from the official biblical canon for reasons that go dramatically beyond legitimate theological considerations or objective scholarly criteria. These extraordinary and revelatory texts, known academically as apocryphal literature, contain incredibly detailed, specific, and fascinating accounts of crucial aspects of Jesus' life that go dramatically and significantly beyond what we find in the 4 traditional Gospels we know and that have been officially canonized. But here arises the fundamental question that should keep you awake at night, that should obsess your curious mind, that should generate a deep and unquenchable intellectual restlessness. Why does virtually no one in modern churches ever speak or even casually mention Jesus' actual biological brothers? What deep, paralyzing, absolutely terrifying fear did the most powerful church authorities have that this specific information would ever get completely out into the public eye without institutional control? The answer to these fundamental questions is infinitely more disturbing, more politically complex, more institutionally compromising than any average believer could imagine in their darkest nightmares and most daring speculations. Jesus' brothers represented an absolutely massive theological problem, a gigantic doctrinal challenge, a monumental interpretive crisis for early Christian leaders who were desperately and urgently trying to build a unified, coherent, and politically viable doctrinal structure that could sustain the weight of an expanding religious movement. If Jesus had real biological brothers, this automatically, directly, and undeniably implied that Mary had had other children after him through completely normal, natural, and expected marital relations with Joseph, according to the Jewish marriage customs of the time. This simple biological reality directly and frontally threatened entire doctrines that were being meticulously and carefully constructed around the theological concept of Mary's perpetual virginity as a fundamental, indispensable, and central element of the emerging Marian theology that was developing. But the theological problem extended much deeper and more problematically than these specific Mariological considerations. Jesus' brothers were not insignificant supporting characters, forgettable marginal figures, or unimportant anecdotal references in the historical development of early Christianity. James, for one specific and documented example, quickly and legitimately became the undisputed, respected, and recognized leader of the early church in Jerusalem, the most important, most influential, and most authoritative Christian community of the entire apostolic age, immediately following the crucifixion. He was widely, consistently, and universally known and respected as James the Just, and he possessed genuine spiritual authority, royal administrative influence, and charismatic leadership that competed directly and problematically with the authority simultaneously claimed by Peter and Paul in their respective spheres of geographic and theological influence. This triangular competition for legitimate leadership of the expanding Christian movement created massive political tensions, deep theological conflicts, and complicated administrative divisions that later writers and editors preferred to drastically simplify by completely eliminating any detailed, specific, or problematic mention of these extremely inconvenient brothers from the unified, official narrative they wanted to meticulously construct for their own doctrinal and institutional political purposes. The fundamental question you must honestly and courageously ask yourself at this crucial moment is this: who specifically had the legitimate moral right and authentic spiritual authority to arbitrarily decide which parts of Jesus' real life you could know and which should be completely erased from official history forever? The official story we have been told repeatedly for centuries and centuries presents the formation of the biblical canon as a completely natural, organic, and divinely inspired process, carefully, suggesting that the included texts were chosen exclusively and objectively for their absolutely unquestionable historical authenticity, while those excluded were rejected solely for being clearly false documents chronologically late or theologically incompatible with authentic revelation. But the meticulously documented historical reality is infinitely more complex, more politically manipulative, more institutionally self-serving, and more deliberately deceptive than religious institutions have ever allowed the believing masses to fully understand. During the famous and momentous Council of Nicea in 325 AD, and at multiple subsequent councils spanning several consecutive centuries, a relatively small group of specific men with very clear political agendas, defined economic interests, and precise institutional goals met deliberately to decide, definitively and irrevocably, which texts would be officially considered sacred, divinely inspired, and doctrinally acceptable, and which would disappear forever, ever from the collective memory of believing humanity. These absolutely momentous decisions, which directly affected millions of people for millennia, were not based solely on objective theological criteria, unbiased historical considerations, or honest scholarly evaluations, as we have been consistently led to believe. These were profoundly and primarily political decisions made by men with very clear, very specific, and very protected institutional interests. Men who desperately needed to create a completely unified, politically viable, and administratively manageable doctrine that would perfectly serve the expansive interests of the Roman imperial power that had recently adopted Christianity as the official state religion for its own political and administrative purposes. The Gospels that specifically, repeatedly, and in detail mentioned Jesus' biological siblings were systematically, deliberately, and meticulously marginalized during this process because they simply did not fit into the sophisticated, politically expedient, and doctrinally useful theological narrative that these councils meticulously wanted to construct for their own specific political and institutional doctrinal purposes. The Gospel of the Hebrews, which had been widely, legitimately, and consistently used by early Jewish Christian communities for decades, without controversy, explicitly, specifically, and in detail mentioned James as both the direct biological brother of Jesus and the absolutely legitimate, authentic, and recognized leader of the early church, with real spiritual authority that directly and problematically rivaled the authority simultaneously claimed by Peter in his role as the purported first pope. This fundamental and historically important gospel was officially declared heretical by the councils, and its copies were systematically, organizedly, and meticulously destroyed in operations that can only be described as organized campaigns of deliberate cultural destruction and systematic religious genocide. Only tiny fragments survived, occasionally quoted by other authors writing specifically about heresies, in order to scholarly refute them. And these precious limited fragments are absolutely all we have today of a text that was once central, foundational, and indispensable to entire Christian communities that had personally known Jesus and his family. The systematic censorship process was so absolutely exhaustive, so meticulously organized, and so completely effective that for centuries afterward, the overwhelming majority of Christians were unaware that these alternative texts had ever existed in the history of early Christianity. The most important and powerful monastic libraries jealously guarded the few manuscripts that had miraculously managed to survive the systematic purges, deliberately and carefully, keeping them away from ordinary believers who might ask extremely uncomfortable questions, raise institutional doubts, or create doctrinal problems if they had free access to this explosive information. Only the most privileged, most political, reliable, and most institutionally loyal scholars had strictly restricted and carefully supervised access to this explosive information, and the overwhelming majority of these privileged scholars maintained absolute silence throughout their lives out of completely justified fear of severe ecclesiastical reprisals that could completely destroy their academic careers, their social lives, and their personal safety. The councils not only arbitrarily and unilaterally decided which specific books to include in the final compilation of the official Bible that would be distributed to the masses, they also established the absolutely mandatory official interpretations, the doctrinally acceptable explanations, and theologically permissible understandings of texts that were indeed included in the final canon. When the canonical Gospels inevitably mention Jesus' brothers in passages that could not be completely edited or removed without Creating obvious narrative inconsistencies, the councils unilaterally and authoritatively decided that these absolutely clear references had to be forcibly and artificially reinterpreted as references to distant cousins, distant relatives, or half-siblings from previous marriages. Never again as direct biological siblings from the same mother and father. Write to me in the comments. Do you think the Church had the moral right to decide what we can know about Jesus? The apocryphal texts that miraculously survived 17 consecutive centuries of systematic censorship, organized institutional persecution, deliberate destruction, and cultural suppression, offer us an absolutely fascinating, extraordinarily reveille, and historically invaluable window into a completely different, more human, and significantly more complex understanding of Jesus, his actual earthly family, and the social, cultural, and religious dynamics surrounding his transformative public ministry. The Gospel of Thomas, dramatically and fortuitously discovered at Nagamadi in 1945, as part of a Gnostic library carefully buried to protect it from systematic destruction, contains direct, specific, and unique sayings of Jesus that appear in no other canonical text known to modern scholars to date. Some of these specific and revelatory sayings make absolutely clear, direct, and undeniable references to his actual biological siblings and to the completely normal and humanly understandable family tensions that existed in their home during his active and transformative ministry. In saying number 99, absolutely crucial to our understanding, Jesus responds to a completely ordinary and predictable family situation by specifically saying, "Those standing here said to me, 'Your brothers and your mother are patiently waiting for you outside.' He said to them plainly, 'Those who are here consistently doing the will of my heavenly Father are truly and authentically my brothers and my mother.' This specific and direct reference in no way denies the real physical and biological existence of flesh and blood siblings, but rather establishes an important and profound theological distinction between earthly blood family and the spiritual family that naturally forms around the common shared and authentic search for divine truth and spiritual transformation. The Gospel of Philip, another absolutely revolutionary and theologically challenging text discovered in the same extraordinary library, goes considerably further in its specific and detailed family revelations. It specifically, explicitly, and in detail mentions that the Savior's constant companions are Mary Magdalene, Mary her mother, her sister, and Miriam, who was also called her companion. This extraordinary gospel speaks completely naturally and casually of brothers and sisters as an absolutely normal, expected, and ordinary part of Jesus' extended family without any apparent theological controversy or doctrinal problem. This particular gospel was considered so theologically dangerous, so doctrinally subversive, and so politically threatening by church authorities that it was banned completely under penalty of immediate excommunication, and for centuries on end, we only knew tiny fragments that had survived in quotations from other authors writing specifically to refute these teachings considered heretical and dangerous to the Orthodox faith. The Gospel, according to the Hebrews, which was precisely the main central and foundational gospel consistently used by the early Jewish Christian communities who had personally and directly known Jesus and his family during his earthly life, recounted Jesus' life-changing baptism in a dramatically and significantly different way than the versions we know in the official canonical Gospels. According to the absolutely precious fragments that have miraculously survived through indirect accounts, after the transformative and revelatory baptism in the Jordan, Jesus immediately and naturally returns to his family home and speaks extensively and in detail with his entire family, specifically and explicitly, including his immediate biological siblings, about the profound, transformative, and revelatory spiritual experience he had just undergone by the sacred river. This extraordinary and humanizing account presents Jesus as someone who maintains completely normal, natural, and appropriate family ties, and who considers it natural, normal, and appropriate to share his most intimate, personal, and transformative spiritual experiences with his immediate earthly family, without any artificial separation between the sacred and the familial. But perhaps the most striking, most revelatory, and most theologically revolutionary textual evidence comes from the Gospel of James, also known academically and specifically as the Proto-Evangelium of James. This absolutely fascinating and historically invaluable text, which the most respected scholars securely and consensually date to the mid-SE century AD, meticulously, thoroughly, and specifically narrates the entire story of Mary from her miraculous birth until several years after the birth of Jesus, including family details that appear in no other known text. Curiously and significantly, this specific gospel mentions explicitly, directly, and categorically that Joseph was a widower and already had several children from a completely legitimate, recognized, and accepted previous marriage when he subsequently married Mary according to the traditional Jewish marriage customs of the time. According to this detailed and specific account, Jesus' brothers would technically be his half-bros, direct biological children of Joseph, but not of Mary, thus maintaining the doctrine of virginity while acknowledging familial reality. This theologically sophisticated and carefully constructed account attempted to meticulously and thoughtfully preserve the emerging doctrine of Mary's virginity, while simultaneously acknowledging the absolutely undeniable historical existence of the brothers who are mentioned repeatedly, specifically, and consistently in other independent contemporary texts. The historical evidence concerning Jesus' brothers completely transcends the limits of the apocryphal texts and extends into secular, scholarly, and contemporary historical sources that had absolutely no religious agenda to defend, promote, or protect. Internationally respected historians such as Flavius Josephus, who wrote meticulously and professionally during the 1st century AD with direct access to contemporary sources, specifically directly and unequivocally mentions James as the brother of Jesus, called Christ in his monumental Antiquities of the Jews. This particular reference appears specifically in the context of the detailed description of political and religious events in Jerusalem, and is considered completely authentic by the overwhelming majority of the most respected modern scholars who have dedicated entire decades to the critical study, linguistic analysis, and historical verification of Josephus's texts. Josephus had no Christian agenda to promote, no theological interest to defend, or any religious doctrine to protect. He was simply recounting contemporary historical events of his time with the professional accuracy of a trained historian and the objectivity of a secular observer. The Jewish historian would never have used the specific Greek word adelphos, brother, in a metaphorical, symbolic, or theological sense when referring to specific documented familial relationships. Or Josephus, James, was literally, directly, and biologically the brother of Jesus, period. The most sophisticated, modern, linguistic and theological analyses have revealed something absolutely fascinating that religious institutions prefer to keep totally silent. The original Koine Greek and Aramaic texts use specific and technically precise words for brother, adoulos in Greek, aa in Aramaic, that simply cannot be easily, naturally, or academically interpreted as cousin, distant relative, or any other indirect familial relationship without completely straining the natural meaning of the text. When the New Testament writers wanted to refer specifically to cousins, they used entirely different words like anepsios in Greek. The modern insistence on translating or reinterpreting adelphos as something other than direct biological brother is a completely post hoc, artificial, and academically dishonest linguistic manipulation not a natural, historical, or academically honest interpretation of the original text. Archaeologists have discovered uwuris, bone burial boxes, in careful excavations around Jerusalem with Aramaic inscriptions, specifically mentioning James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Although there is legitimate scholarly debate about the specific authenticity of some of these particular inscriptions due to the inherent complexities of archaeological verification and the possibility of modern forgeries, the familial nomenclature these inscriptions use is entirely consistent with the onastic practices of the period and with the multiple textual references we have from independent sources. The early church fathers, those Christian leaders who lived chronologically closest to the apostolic age and who had direct access to oral traditions that were later completely lost, had notably different perspectives on this specific issue compared to the interpretations that became authoritative centuries later. Hegipus, a 2th-century Christian historian who wrote extensively on the early church, wrote in considerable detail about Jesus' family and specifically and repeatedly mentioned his brothers as recognized and respected leaders of the early Christian communities in Jerusalem and other major cities. Clement of Alexandria, another widely respected early church father, also made natural and uncontroversial references to Jesus' brothers as real people who played important administrative and spiritual roles in shaping early Christianity. It was only in later centuries, when the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity became absolutely central to emerging official theology, that these clear and direct references began to be systematically reinterpreted, minimized, or completely ignored by theologians with specific doctrinal agendas to defend and power structures to protect. For over 1,700 consecutive years, this absolutely undeniable historical truth was deliberately buried under layers and layers of sophisticated theological interpretation, organized institutional manipulation, and systematic cultural censorship. But the historical evidence remains unshaken in the archives. The documents are physically there, waiting to be studied by anyone with scholarly access. The linguistic analyses are academically clear and irrefutable. The multiple and independent historical references are completely verifiable. True faith fears absolutely nothing in the face of documented and verifiable historical truth. This seemingly simple phrase contains a complete spiritual revolution that directly and fundamentally challenges the very foundations of the institutional religious manipulation that has controlled narratives for millennia. If your personal faith falters, collapses, or crumbles in the face of documented historical evidence, then perhaps it was never authentic faith in the first place, but systematic indoctrination, carefully disguised, presented, and sold as genuine spirituality. Religious manipulation has worked effectively and systematically for 17 consecutive centuries, meticulously and deliberately, convincing millions of believers that questioning official dogmas is an unforgivable mortal sin, that doubting institutional interpretations is a grave lack of faith, and that independent research is dangerous to the salvation of the soul. But this represents the exact opposite of the truly authentic spiritual quest that should characterize any genuine, personal, and transformative relationship with the divine. The brothers of Jesus do not diminish his divinity or compromise his revolutionary spiritual message. They confirm and strengthen it in an infinitely deeper, more meaningful, and more humanly connected way. If Jesus could perfectly manifest the divine while being fully human, having an absolutely normal family, experiencing the complex and challenging family dynamics we all know intimately, then his revolutionary message becomes exponentially more powerful, more accessible, and more transformative, no less impactful or inspiring. It fundamentally means that the sacred can perfectly manifest itself amidst the completely ordinary, totally everyday, the absolutely earthly and familiar. The religious institutions that systematically and deliberately censored this information did so exclusively out of paralyzing institutional fear. Absolute fear that believers would definitively discover that they do not need human intermediaries to connect directly and personally with the divine. Fear that people would clearly understand that authentic spirituality does not require rigid dogmas, mandatory official interpretations, or intermediary power structures. Fear of completely losing control over the narratives that have maintained their political, economic, and social power for millennia. When you know the full truth about Jesus' siblings, when you deeply understand that he was an integral part of an absolutely real earthly family, his revolutionary teaching on universal love, unconditional compassion, and spiritual transformation takes on a whole new and infinitely more powerful dimension. He was not an ethereal being preaching from a divine ivory tower, completely disconnected from human experience. He was someone who intimately knew the inevitable complexities of family relationships, the constant challenges of being understood by loved ones, and the full human experience in all its richness, difficulty, and beauty. His extraordinary compassion was born directly from direct personal experience, not from distant and detached observation. Honest confrontation with manipulative official doctrine is not about destroying authentic faith, but about completely freeing it from the artificial chains of institutional manipulation. It is about definitively reclaiming your inalienable right to know the full truth and to form your own authentic relationship with the sacred without self-serving intermediaries or controlling power structures. Today, at this precise moment of revelation, you may be on the cusp of definitively awakening to a truth that will change your relationship with God forever in ways you cannot even imagine or anticipate yet. It is no absolute coincidence that you have reached this specific point of revelation at this particular moment in your spiritual life. It is no coincidence that your soul has resonated deeply and viscerally with this information that fundamentally challenges everything you had been taught as unquestionable, absolute, and unchanging truth. For years, perhaps entire decades of your spiritual life, you have felt that nagging restlessness, that deep dissatisfaction that constantly whispered to you that there was so much more than you had been allowed to know, explore, or experience. That insistent and tireless inner voice that repeatedly told you that the truth was infinitely richer, more complex, more beautiful, more human, and more transformative than what limited, restrictive, and artificial official doctrines allowed you to fully explore or experience. Jesus' siblings represent something far deeper and more transcendent than simply an interesting historical fact or an unimportant academic curiosity. They represent the absolutely revolutionary possibility of a spirituality that is entirely more authentic, more integrated, more genuinely human, and more transformatively real. When you fully and completely accept that Jesus had real biological siblings, you are simultaneously accepting that the sacred can be perfectly manifest in the most ordinary, most commonplace, and most humanly recognizable circumstances of everyday life. You are deeply and fundamentally recognizing that the family, with all its inevitable complexities, constant challenges, and imperfect dynamics, can be a sacred temple of authentic spiritual growth, personal transformation, and divine unfoldment. Your personal spiritual quest can now include the transformative wisdom of knowing that you are not absolutely alone on your path of spiritual development. Jesus also navigated the complex family dynamics we all face daily. He also experienced being misunderstood by those closest to him emotionally. He also had to carefully and wisely balance his spiritual mission with his earthly familial responsibilities and normal social obligations. This doesn't make it any less divine, any less inspiring, or any less transformative. It makes it infinitely more accessible, more real, more present, and more personally relevant to your own everyday, ordinary human experience. The truth about your brothers and sisters completely and definitively frees you to explore your own spirituality without the artificial boundaries, arbitrary restrictions, and baseless prohibitions that others have authoritatively imposed for centuries. It allows you to ask profound questions without paralyzing guilt, to inquire without institutional fear, to question without feeling you are betraying your authentic faith or compromising your spiritual integrity, because true faith is dramatically and exponentially strengthened by truth, never ever weakened by real knowledge, honest inquiry, or authentic searching. Your spiritual awakening is not just personal and individual. It is part of a massive global movement of consciousnesses that are categorically rejecting manipulation and consciously choosing authentic truth over institutional comfort, dogmatic security, or religious conformity. From what part of the world are you watching this video at this pivotal moment? I would love to know how far this hidden truth, which has been patiently waiting for centuries to be fully revealed, uncensored, is reaching, because this dramatically transcends a simple educational video. It's a massive global awakening. It's a silent but powerful revolution of consciousnesses that are definitively and irreversibly rejecting institutional manipulation and consciously choosing the authentic truth, no matter how uncomfortable, challenging, or transformative it may be. For the established power structures that have controlled the narratives for millennia, what you discover today may definitively and irreversibly be the key to a faith infinitely freer, more authentic, and more transformative than you ever remotely imagined possible. A faith that doesn't depend on manufactured ignorance, censored information, or systematic manipulation, but is constantly nourished by real, verifiable, and authentic knowledge. A spirituality that doesn't fear the deepest, most challenging, or most uncomfortable questions, but celebrates them as an essential, fundamental, and indispensable part of authentic spiritual growth and genuine personal transformation. The Brothers of Jesus don't pose a threat to your personal relationship with God. They are an extraordinary and revolutionary invitation to deepen it in ways you never imagined possible before this pivotal moment of revelation and awakening. Your authentic spiritual awakening doesn't end here at all. In fact, it's only just beginning in a real, powerful, and irreversible way. Because when you have the personal courage to question one systematically hidden truth, you develop the spiritual fortitude, intellectual confidence, and emotional independence to investigate many other truths that have been deliberately and systematically hidden by the same power structures. Your mind opens exponentially and dramatically to possibilities previously completely blocked by institutional fear, systematic conditioning, and organized religious manipulation. Your heart expands infinitely to embrace a vastly broader, deeper, and more transformative understanding of what it truly means to be spiritual in a complex, manipulative world filled with institutionalized structures of control. The personal, spiritual mission you are consciously and courageously undertaking is absolutely sacred, completely legitimate, and profoundly transformative. It is your inalienable divine right to know the complete truth about your own faith without institutional filters, religious censorship, or dogmatic manipulation. It is your fundamental spiritual responsibility to research independently, question everything without exception, and form your own conclusions based on real, verifiable evidence, not on dogmas imposed by power structures with specific economic, political, and social interests to protect and maintain. The Brothers of Jesus constantly remind you that authentic spiritual family can include both those who share your blood and those who genuinely and passionately share your tireless pursuit of truth without artificial boundaries. They teach you that divine love can be perfectly and completely expressed in fully human, ordinary, earthly relationships, and that the sacred does not require artificial perfection, separation from the world, or detachment from human experience to manifest powerfully in your life. Your infinitely freer and more authentic faith will be one that can sustain the real complexity of life, embrace the fullness of humanity without artificial judgment, and encounter the divine precisely in the midst of real, everyday human experience, not despite it or apart from it. If you felt this message spoke directly and deeply to your soul, subscribe right now, because in the next video we're going to reveal another absolutely explosive secret that the church never wanted you to know. We're going to explore the texts that were systematically burned, the libraries that were deliberately destroyed, and the truths that were buried along with their discoverers. The story of Jesus, brothers, is only the tip of the iceberg of a massive conspiracy, of silence that spans millennia. There are infinitely deeper, more shocking, more transformative secrets waiting to be revealed. Secrets about Jesus' early life that the canonical Gospels completely omitted. Secrets about his advanced teachings that were only passed on to an intimate circle of disciples. Secrets about the true meaning of his parables that have been misinterpreted for centuries. Your subscription isn't simply a click. It's a powerful declaration that you consciously choose truth over comfort, real knowledge over manufactured ignorance, authentic spiritual freedom over institutional religious manipulation. Click on the video that will appear on your screen. The next revelation will impact you even more profoundly than this one, because we're going to talk about something that could change not only your understanding of Jesus, but your entire understanding of what it means to be truly spiritual in this manipulated world. Thank you for watching this video until the end. We will see you in the next